Hello everybody, this is the BG, and for this episode we're going to learn how to make Korean hot maple sausage. This particular variant came about when a Korean friend of mine asked if I could replace the restaurant pepper in the regular maple recipe with Korean pepper flake. I said let's try it, and it turned out to be delicious.
The equipment that you need to make maple sausage depends on whether or not you want to grind your own meat and also whether you want to freeze it to eat later. If you want to grind your own meat, you'll need knives, cutting boards, and a meat grinder. If you want to save your sausage to eat later, you'll also need supplies for vacuum sealing, including a vacuum sealer, a roll of vacuum sealing bags, scissors, a ruler, and a marker. If you don't want to grind the meat or save it for later, you'll just need the basic ingredients and equipment: 2.5 pounds of ground pork, kosher salt, Korean pepper flake, dark maple syrup, a small and medium mixing bowl, measuring spoons and cups, rubber spatula, and a whisk, and finally a digital scale, small, medium, and large aluminum pans, and gloves.
To make sausage, we need to actually start with grinding the meat. If you don't have a meat grinder, you can actually just buy pre-ground pork at the store and then season it yourself, so you can skip ahead. But in this video, we're going to describe the entire process of going from taking a whole chunk of meat and cutting it up and grinding it, and then adding the seasoning to it. The first step to making sausage is cutting up the meat. What I'm showing here is a pork Boston butt. This is the very top half of the shoulder, and I like it because it has the right amount of fat to lean ratio where you don't have to weigh anything. You can just out of the box cut up this chunk of meat and have a pretty good ratio for making sausage. I'm simply cutting this chunk of meat into strips small enough to fit in the throat of the grinder. I've experimented with cutting into chunks and to strips. At least with my old number 8 size grinder, I preferred cutting in strips. I upgraded to a number 22 grinder last year, and I think it actually might do better with chunks, so I've been playing with that recently. What you need to do though is just get the meat into smaller pieces that will actually fit into the grinder. Next step is to actually grind the meat. The only thing I'm doing here is just feeding in the meat slowly. What you're looking for is to make sure that you're not backing up the grinder. You're looking to see that meat is actually progressing through the auger head and being ground. One thing to take note of at the very beginning of when you're grinding the meat is to see how fast the meat is coming out of the grinder head. You want to have just a visual of that so that over time, if you're grinding lots of meat, you can evaluate if things are getting bogged down or not. If it seems like meat is being ground too slowly, a half hour into grinding a large quantity of meat, you probably need to take the whole assembly apart and clean the cutter head and the grinding plate and so forth. But that's the only thing that we're doing here, is you're just carefully feeding in the meat, looking at how fast it's actually being fed into the machine. From the processing side of it, you're looking at what the fat ratio is coming out. You can see how white the little streaks of meat are. If you have a very lean section, you need to mix that, across the pan, and then if you have a very fatty section, you want to streak that across the pan too. I'm looking to make sure that the ratio of fat to meat stays roughly the same around the pan, so I'm always moving around, looking at how fatty or how lean the meat is coming out of the grinder. With all of the meat ground, the next step is to portion it into the amounts needed to make the recipe. In this video, I'm going to be making a 2.5 pound recipe for the maple sausage. I would normally be doing this in 10-pound batches, but since this is probably going to be more for the home cooks, it's a little bit easier to deal with a 2.5 pound batch. The next step is to prepare the seasoning mixture. For this, we only require 3 ingredients. You want to have the darkest maple syrup that you can get a hold of, kosher salt, and then Korean pepper flake. I'm going to add in 1/2 cup of the maple syrup, and then make sure you use a spatula to scrape out all of it so that you're getting the full 1/2 cup. 1 tablespoon of the kosher salt, and then 1 1/4 tablespoons of the Korean pepper flake. Mix the ingredients together well with a whisk and then set to the side. The next step is to put the meat into a larger pan. I have a medium-sized aluminum pan here, and then I'm going to press it out and then put a couple divots in it with my fingers to make it easier for the liquid to disperse itself. Then pour the mixture over the meat and then mix extremely well. What I am doing here is I am mixing left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top, making sure that I'm getting all the way underneath the meat and then kneading it into itself. It's almost like you're kneading a ball of dough. Take note of the meat texture as you start mixing it here. It's going to be extremely loose at the beginning, but over time, when you knead it, it's going to get tighter and tighter. You're going to be done kneading it when it gets to the point that it has some springiness to it, where if you actually form it into a ball and you were to slap it, it's going to have a spring to it. That's how you know that you're done, is by how tight that meat mixture is. After you finish kneading it, I put it into a smaller loaf pan. You don't need to do this step, I was just doing it to make it easier to look at. With the meat fully mixed, the next step is to get it portioned into 1 pound balls. The way that I have this recipe done, I started out with 2.5 pounds of meat. After you add in the maple syrup and the seasoning, you're going to do about 2.8 pounds total. So you can either have 2 1-pound balls and like a 0.8 pound ball, or you can split it up evenly to get like 0.9 across the board if you'd like to. It's up to you. Normally what I would do in this case is I would freeze the 2 1-pound balls, and then the 0.8 pound I would just fry up immediately. The last step to making this maple sausage is getting it ready for the freezer. So what I like to do, based on what you've already seen in the other videos, is I use an 8-inch wide roll, and then I will cut it 10 inches long. That's a good size bag for 1 pound of meat, and that could be 1 pound of the bulk sausage, 1 pound of the link sausage, or 1 pound of ghetto when we get onto that video later in the season. I'll start with sealing one end of the bag, turning it around, rolling over the bag edges so that it's easier to put the meat in without getting all the bag dirty. You're going to form the meatball into more of a football. It's easier to slide in if it's not just an actual sphere, but more of like a football. Slide that in to the bag, and then you don't press it out at this point. Just leave it as a ball, and then finish sealing the bag. This is a much easier process if you have 2 people, because then one person can have their hands dirty while the other person always has clean hands. With the bag fully sealed, next step is to press out the meat roughly to the edges of the bag and try to flatten it. And then I have a thick plate of aluminum that I use to actually press the bag out to be perfectly flat. Then the last step is to label it. This bag is ready for the freezer, and it will keep easily for 12 months. I've had these go for 18 months and not notice any difference. I personally don't want to experiment after 18 months. I mean, basically nothing in my freezer lasts for more than 12 months. We eat it within the year. So there you go. That's how you make Korean hot maple sausage. Give it a try. It's just as easy to make as the regular maple sausage. Gives you more versatility. It can be a breakfast sausage. It can also be a dinner sausage if you want it to be. My daughter enjoyed the maple leaf that I cut out of the maple sausage so much that I decided to do it a second time for the Korean maple. So enjoy the plating. It's the BG, keeping it square. Go out and make some sausage, everybody. I'll see you next month.
Thanks for watching today. If you're new to this channel, yes, we are making sausage, but no, we're not selling it. And if you're disgusted by sausage making, like, what are you doing here? Life is too short. Go find your thing. We found ours. In our next video, we're digging into our Ohio roots and sharing with you a Cincinnati specialty, geta. Never heard of it? You are in for a treat. Subscribe to us, check out our website, and we'll see you next time on Our Final Freezer.
So, can you open this?
I can't open it right now. What is wrong? Why are we touching this?